It's really a delight to be here with you all. I've really enjoyed my stay in Hungary so far, and it's great to meet people from different institutions. So this has been wonderful, and I'm learning a lot about Hungary while I'm here. So this what I want to do is talk to you about basically a research program that I started 3 years ago when I left the Carter Center as director. And I was motivated a lot by my work at the Carter Center to explore these questions. So this is a large research program, and I'm going to try to provide you kind of an overview with some of the results and the current work that's in progress, because I would love to have your feedback, your suggestions, and ideas. So the motivating questions for this research program are these. What causes democratic societies to divide to the point of viewing the other as an existential threat to the nation? And that's what I'm talking about as a form of political tribalism that we're witnessing in many democracies today. And what are the consequences for democracy of this kind of division? And then, most importantly to me and my collaborators, is how can we prevent such outcomes or mitigate their negative impact on democracy? So we're really looking at strategies to decrease the negative consequences for democracy. Now, I was motivated by the master polarizer, Hugo Chavez, because I did a lot of work. I'm kind of Venezuela has been my country of expertise in my academic career for 30 years. And while I was director at the Carter Center, I managed the project where we were invited to monitor the elections, the first international monitors in Venezuela, and it was the first election when Chavez was elected in 1998. In Venezuela, and so I've both studied Venezuela as an academic and worked there as a democracy specialist and a mediator. Then we were invited to mediate the conflict. So I've seen close at hand the evolution of Venezuela and what's happened to it. And so it's an exemplar case of what I'm talking about. And then I started to see this happening in other parts of the world. So that's what really motivated this project. But you think about this, Chavez was able to mobilize a marginalized group, people who felt like they had been underrepresented and ignored by the basic political establishment. Venezuela was a democracy for 40 years, so it was before Chavez came to power. So the urban and rural poor. He identified discursively dimensions of polarization as a typical populist one, elite versus people, but also he brought in political and economic ideology as dividing lines that he emphasized to create a very strong us versus them atmosphere. And you can see what happened. He comes in 1998, elected, really implements a very confrontational, polarizing strategy, generates an elite backlash, mass protest. They attempt to oust him through all kinds of means, including a military coup. He defeats all of those efforts to overcome him and then begins to concentrate power and begin a real authoritarian trend until he died of cancer in 2013. His successor started out very weak, that's Nicolas Maduro, and the opposition finally got another foothold back in the government after 10 years of no representation. So they had a divided government because opposition controlled the legislature and the Chavista party controlled everything else. And we've seen growing authoritarianism until today, what I would call a completely authoritarian, and if you've seen the news, really a failed state, but under these new Chavista elites. So this is one of the patterns that I looked at, and then I started looking around the world and seeing similar patterns, and that's what really motivated this research project. So the goal is to advance knowledge about the causes, consequences, and solutions to severe political and societal polarization in democracy. So I'm talking about democracies, I'm talking about political divisions and political conflict. I'm not focusing on violent conflicts or post-Civil War, though I do feel like we need to look more at those strategies that we might be able to use in the political conflicts. The first phase was a macro-level comparative study of the causal pathways. And so I recruited an international group of scholars, held a couple of workshops, including one here in Budapest 2 years ago, and we've published our initial work in these 2 volumes up here, last year and this year, that I edited with Murat Somer from Koç University in Turkey. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of the results of that, and then phase 2 is what I'm really working on here, which is the micro level now, coming down to the individual level, really getting much more into political psychology and social psychology to examine the causes and possible antidotes to tribalism and support for democratic erosion. That's what I'm working on here, and that's where the experiments come in. So what I want to do today is give you kind of an overview of the theory developed from the comparative macro phase about how does pernicious polarization develop and how does it harm democracy. And I apologize because Jolt has heard this already. But then I want to show you some of our initial results from the micro level phase, and hopefully a little bit new since the last talk you saw, Jolt. And especially looking to counteract these negative consequences. So at the micro level, the online survey experiment is examining injustice and the associated emotions. So we're interested in the emotions as well, and how they activate political attitudes. And we're looking at populism, polarization or tribalism, and democratic erosion. When do people actually support a leader that's violating democratic norms? And then the possible antidotes. So, starting with phase 1, the comparative case studies, we took 11 very dissimilar cases, all positive cases of polarization, to look at the common experience. What were the common mechanisms we saw from countries ranging from Thailand and the Philippines to Turkey and Hungary to the United States and Venezuela. 11 cases across the globe. And we saw varying outcomes for democracy. So that's what we were trying to look at first. The first goal, to identify the common causal mechanisms of when a normal polarization, which happens in every democracy, turns into this pernicious polarization. So your first question is going to be, didn't you select on the dependent variable? Yes, we did, because we're looking at these causal mechanisms. And we identified the risk factors that we found from those that would produce different outcomes for democracy that I will tell you about. So these are just some examples of the polarizations that we're looking at. The United States, with at least so far a deteriorating quality of democracy and some, real fears of backsliding. Hungary, having moved into an illiberal democracy in the Prime Minister's own words, and with polarizations both around immigration and now, the picture I took of the billboard when I arrived, polarization around the question of the EU's role in Hungary. Turkey, having moved to at least a hyper-presidential system and most likely a competitive authoritarian, though my co-author Murat Somer says he's not quite ready to call it that. He thinks it's in flux, and we're looking at what really happens with the results of these elections this month and the challenges to them before determining. Venezuela, having moved already to a civil military authoritarian regime, and now since January of this year, actual dual presidencies with Maduro on the left and the young opposition leader who declared himself president on the right, Juan Guaido. So we have 2 people claiming the presidency in Venezuela today. And finally, the most extreme example of democratic collapse among our cases was Thailand, between the red shirts and the yellow shirts, alternating since 2005, but finally in 2014 collapsing into a military authoritarian state. So what do I mean by pernicious polarization? Well, it is a very severe form of political polarization that simplifies politics. So in political science terms, the normal cross-cutting differences that we expect to see are instead consolidated and reinforced around a single dividing line, an us versus them dimension. So we've collapsed those cross-cutting cleavages and interest into two camps where those interests are aligned and now reinforcing a single cleavage. So at the political level, basically, people sort into like-minded groups on either side of the dividing line. The center drops out. They view politics as a zero-sum game. And adversaries change. Instead of adversaries with which we used to compete politically, now we view the other side as enemies to be eliminated. It also extends into the societal level. So it becomes, political identity becomes a social identity in this pernicious polarization. So citizens actually internalize the partisan divide, and the society becomes divided spatially, geographically. You see divisions. People are living, moving, and working with like-minded people. And they view, most importantly, they start to view the other as an existential threat to their way of life. So that is at the extreme level, and that's, of course, the most dangerous to democracy. In this process, the stereotyping, the prejudice, the bias that we form against the other people increases, and especially as we begin to stop communication with the others or social interaction, then our bias and prejudice and even conspiracy theories about them increase. Now, how does that differ from the conventional concept of polarization? You know, in political science and mostly in Europe, but especially in the United States, it's measured as ideological distance between parties or between citizens, or the distance between party representatives and citizen attitudes based on a left-right or a liberal-conservative scale, essentially. We are not doing that. We're looking at this very pernicious dividing. We don't think a left-right scale is sufficient to explain what's happening in our countries or for citizens to even identify themselves on an ideological scale anymore, because it means something so different to different citizens and in different countries. What we do mean is that it's a very political concept, a process, and especially it's political because political entrepreneurs are choosing a polarizing strategy for their own political ends. And their ends might be laudable ends. They may be, you know, very positive goals, transforming a democracy, bringing people in, a more inclusionary democracy, or changing economic structures to bring about more social justice. Or it might be just to gain power for whatever they want to do. We kept debating this about Hugo Chavez. What does he want with all this power that he is consolidating? You know, he said what he wanted. People had always thought that his ideology, it was developing throughout. It was shifting, but you know, that basically it's power that he wanted. So, you know, that's a question that we can't answer now that he's died. But to gain power or to retain power. Because politicians know that polarization is a very winning electoral strategy. It's also relational. So polarization requires another side, two poles. And so how the opposition reacts, how they're structured and organized, what their capacities are, is very important as well in determining whether we reach this pernicious polarization. So we do start with these assumptions that, in fact, polarization doesn't have to be negative. What I was saying, it can be constructive. You can polarize to disrupt a status quo that is inequitable or unfair. And so you could be trying to deepen democracy. But what we're concerned about is the risk of it turning destructive and especially self-sustaining, as both sides lock themselves into a spiral, a downward spiral. What are the conditions that produce that? And then how can we get out of it? And it's very difficult to get out of. So that's why we said our initial aim was to identify what are those risk factors and the causal mechanisms that turn it pernicious. And then the next phase is to identify the strategies to contain polarization. So this is the next phase at the macro level, what particularly opposition strategies should be to contain the polarization before it becomes pernicious, or to depolarize once it does. and then the micro level, which are the experiments I mentioned. All right, so the findings from the comparative case studies, very briefly. Okay, this is a little bit complicated, but this is the basic theory that we came up with in looking at the causal chain of what happens in these countries. So you start with some polarizing context. So there is some grievance in a society. It might be economic, it might be unemployment, it might be, at least the perception, the grievance that I've lost my job because of the immigrants coming to the country, or the Chinese, when actually the reason probably is automation, but most people don't look at that. It might be cultural, demographic, and certainly the diversification of societies. So just taking the United States, not only the immigrant, but the changing role of women, the growing diversity of religion, and so that now we have what I would view a group of white Christian males who view themselves, their status in society as decreasing because of these just demographic changes. And it might be political representation deficits or gaps. So the grievance might be about a crisis of representation. And whatever the polarizing, the underlying grievances are, we can see perceptions of group threat, which might be that first one I mentioned, the loss of power status. Some group who was in power, and now they feel threatened by other upcoming groups, surging groups, or external threats. Or it might be perceived inequity or injustice, so relative deprivation. It feels like my group is not getting what we deserve, either distributive justice from distribution of tax revenues, or the other group is getting more than they deserve. And so if you've read anything like Catherine Kramer's Politics of Resentment about Wisconsin, or Arlie Hochschild's book Strangers in Their Own Land, it really focuses on this deservingness, that some other group is getting more than they deserve. They're not the hard-working groups. They may be the civil servants who have a cushy government job. But we are particularly the rural, hard-working laborers. We're not getting what we deserve, either in terms of respect, political representation and power, or economic justice. And then those perceptions of group threat produce emotions, and particularly resentment, anxiety, and anger. And we were focusing more on resentment to start with, but they produce emotions. In here now we have polarizing rhetoric. So these perceptions of group threat then become exacerbated by those political entrepreneurs who are coming, and Donald Trump is a master at this, but others that you can think of are also masters of this, exploiting those perceptions, exacerbating, intensifying the emotions, and helping to form our tribal political formation. Now these are some of the indicators that we're proposing that we could use to measure and operationalize tribal political formation. So negative partisanship, affective polarization, stereotyping, zero-sum perceptions, conspiracy, and incivility. I'll show you what we used for this particular study. We focused on the first two for this study. And then with this tribal political formation, where we're viewing with bias and distrust the other side, then we are much less willing to compromise politically, and we view the other as an out-group threat, as an existential threat. So we moved here, which affects behavior and perceptions, and then that affects our democracies, both the governance capacity, because the parties refuse to compromise, to negotiate, or if one party is strongly in power, such as in Hungary, they may not consult within, they'll just govern unilaterally. And then we have the attitudes that it spurs, the populist, anti-pluralist attitudes, illiberalism, and democratic norm violation. Okay, so in doing those 11 case studies, what we found in those causal mechanisms, kind of 4 findings, is first that it's agency over structure. Agency is absolutely critical. This is really elite-driven across all of our cases. Even when there's mass a mass underpinning and a grievance from below, it really does require an elite. And it's not any specific social cleavage that's necessary or nor sufficient, but there do have to be some grievances. And it's most commonly activated with this Manichaean polarizing discourse that really does focus on the moral difference between us and them. They are bad for some reason. They are evil. In populism, you're probably aware it's used a lot, the idea of a Manichaean discourse that says the elites are conniving, evil elites, out for their own good to the detriment of the people. The people are the virtuous, good, kind of general will, homogeneous population. But what we argue is this is not just a populist phenomena, that this polarization happens in countries and in politics that don't focus on the dividing line being between elites and the people. There are other kinds of dividing lines that I will indicate. Right here, in fact. So what we found is that the actual discursive dimension of what they are focusing on can vary, and it doesn't always match the underlying cleavage. So this is a little bit hard to see, but so the categories would be what is this, the discursive dimension? What is the speech pattern of the rhetoric that the political elite or political entrepreneur is focusing on? So the populist is clear, elite versus people, but it might be a religious secular or church versus state dividing line. What do you know, what's the role of a particular religion or religion versus secular state? It can be a cosmopolitan nationalist, and so one of the questions I'm trying to figure out here is to what extent is it the EU versus the national identity in Eastern Europe that's driving some of these patterns? How important is that? Pro or anti-EU, pro or anti-globalist. And what we put here are the countries that we found that followed these dimensions, and then is this an underlying cleavage or not in the country? And they don't always match, you see. It could be cultural values, modern, traditional, conservative, liberal. Could be basically urban-rural, place and status, urban-rural differences. Economic ideology or class. Could be political ideology. The very concept of democracy is debated. That was debated in Venezuela when they tried to move to a more participatory democracy, or what they called radical protagonism. Even in Thailand, you saw the kind of royal Thai democracy, the old democracy, versus a newer liberal democracy. You might ask if this is the case in Hungary, the actual vision of an illiberal democracy versus something else, a liberal democracy, I guess. And then citizenship rights and national identity as formative risks. I want to talk about that because that was really critical. So the second finding is that the opposition response they basically have three kinds of responses, so the relational part. And what we found in all of our cases of the polarization is they reciprocated. And that locked them into this downward spiral. The alternatives that we're proposing, and we saw in some cases them try but then back away, would be to repolarize, but around a more positive pro-democracy division. And I would argue, this would be that disruptive polarization that might actually be constructive. I would argue that the Democrats are looking to do this in the 2020 elections in the US as we see the more, the stronger leftist appeal of Democratic candidates and their appeals to social justice and economic justice. We may be seeing something like this. Still polarizing, but trying to repolarize around a different issue and to make it more democratic. And then the third would be to actually depolarize through either supporting democratizing reforms, like in Turkey. Erdogan actually, early on, 2002 to 2007, he actually proposed democratizing reforms that the opposition rejected, not because they didn't support the democratic reforms, but because Erdogan was proposing them possibly. So if they had supported that at the beginning, we might have had a different trajectory in Turkey. Or positive electoral mobilization by the opposition with more positive messages, which maybe this is what my co-author Murat argues is what happened in these elections, the local elections in Turkey that just took place, where the opposition actually won Istanbul, apparently, that's the one being contested, but Istanbul and Ankara with a more positive, pro-democratic, and not so much just anti-Erdogan. Same thing with Venezuela, when they actually tried to present something, a more positive message, and not just anti-Chavez, they were much more successful. Then we identified two risk factors that lead to the more enduring pernicious polarization. The first is when the polarization is around what we call formative rifts, which basically have to do with the foundation of the country. What were the divisions or the rifts that were never resolved? What were the debates at the national forming? Now, Hungary is very interesting to me because you have so many foundings. You have a lot of foundings here of different time periods. And so we're saying it could be the refounding of the state as well, so the post-communist era, or a post-authoritarian or a post-civil conflict era in a country. But when these basic questions of national identity, citizenship rights, the foundational myths are unresolved and then are picked up later, you know, in the contemporary period by this polarizing political entrepreneur, that's when they tend to become really pernicious and enduring. Because it's a conflict over who can legitimately represent the polity and who is legitimately a citizen. And so that's what we see in the United States today, going back to the founding unresolved debates or the unequal citizenship for African Americans, women, and Native Americans that have continued up until today, those debates. And who should be a citizen? Obviously, it's even questioned now in the United States. Anyone born in the United States, are we going to continue with the birthright citizenship or change it? So, you know, thinking about what are the debates here in Hungary, I'm really interested to know if you think the polarization is around a formative rift, because we classified it as not, because it seemed to be, well, there's kind of an immigration threat that Orban has made perhaps larger than it actually is. Maybe it's more the perception of a potential threat. And then there's the EU thing, but I'm not sure that that's a formative rift. I would really appreciate your ideas on that. And then, under these conditions, it becomes threatening and causes counter reactions more because it is so basic. So that's the first risk factor. The second risk factor is the mobilization capacity of each side. Not only to put people in the streets, but particularly to mobilize for elections. When there is a relative balance of power in this mobilization capacity, then we can see an alternation, and we saw that in Bangladesh. Between two parties, they basically alternated until one asserted its hegemony, the current government in power, and began to violate civil liberties, putting people in jail, changing electoral rules, and so it can become a one-sided hegemony. If there's an imbalance, so if one side, and the populist, governments can usually mobilize an electoral majority fairly easily, then the other side may control the institutions of accountability, the military, the courts, the bureaucracy, but may not be able to compete electorally. That's what we saw in Thailand. So every time the Thaksin party would mobilize and win elections, the other side would either use the courts or a military coup to oust them. Then they would hold no elections. Again, Thaksin's group would come back in and win. They'd use some other institution to oust them repeatedly until finally they just went outright with the military coup and military state in power. So, the unconstitutional use of accountability mechanisms. Turkey and Venezuela were interesting because early on in both countries, the opposition did control these institutions, these accountability institutions, and they tried to constrain both Erdogan and Chavez. But eventually, as the power balance changed, Erdogan and Chavez both gained control over the institutions as well as the electoral mobilization. And so it shifted, turned around, and became imbalanced. So what we did was we made a 2x2 table with these two factors and tried to predict different outcomes here. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but it's in the published work. And you can see we put Hungary in this one where we said, yes, there are parties with mass capacity, but not a formative rift. And this is the case that we said was indeterminate. So we had a populist transforms a traditional party like in Hungary and Poland, which is also what Trump is doing in the United States. And then we had Venezuela and Greece where the traditional party system weakened. In both cases, the opposition parties basically disintegrated and then had to reformulate and realign into a new opposition. So these are indeterminate outcomes. But then we have this with the enduring, with the rift, the formative rift, and all of these in enduring symmetrical polarization with democratic erosion. And finally, just a quick word on institutions. We find that institutions are just facilitating conditions. They don't definitively predict or resolve, but particularly majoritarian electoral systems. And we found that in every case, the polarizing figure party came into power and tried, or successfully, or at least attempted, to change the electoral rules to further enhance their disproportionate advantage, representation advantage. And the other one is parties as actors are crucial, but the party system itself, the traditional measurement of polarization in a party system, didn't determine it, or the level of institutionalization. We had very highly institutionalized parties and very weakly institutionalized party systems that went through this pattern. And then the common steps to erode democracy, this is kind of what we saw, patterns that they go through these steps. Starting with the electoral rules, creating supermajorities, which then produce the capacity for constitutional change, greater enhancement of executive power, harassing the media, restricting free speech, delegitimizing, dehumanizing the opposition, distrust in expertise information institutions, politicizing the institutions themselves, appointing loyalists rather than merit to courts and bureaucracy, and then creating a threat or an enemy to generate a desire for a savior. So those were common, really, across these countries. So the next stage for the macro level is going to be, we need to examine countries that are negative cases of polarization, that avoided or overcame pernicious polarization. And it's hard to find those. So we're looking for ideas for those. And then we want to unpack the opposition strategies as well. Okay, so let me talk for a minute about the micro level, because this is the current research we're doing with the experiments, and it is getting into this. It gets into the evolutionary basis of human behavior, which is fascinating. I've been learning about this. Psychology, social identity theory, intergroup conflict, relative deprivation and emotions, dominant group status theory, the role of rhetoric especially, framing, motivated reasoning, all of these things come into it. So the research questions we're asking here are these. What rhetorical frames, emotional appeals, and particular grievances serve to activate the populist and tribal political attitudes? Because we assume, especially in the populism literature, there's the idea that there are latent populist attitudes that then become activated, that they're widespread in the population, and then they become activated by some kind of appeal. And then, this is the first study that we know of to look at a deactivation mechanism. So not only, people have been studying, particularly in Europe, how are populist attitudes activated? We want to know how are they deactivated as well. What rhetorical or emotional appeals might deactivate them? And do the same emotional and rhetorical mechanisms work the same way in different types of voters? Whether it's different ideologies, different personalities, different types of voters. So the first experiment where we're exploring this, we did in last November, right after the midterm elections in the United States. We did a large national sample through Qualtrics online survey experiment. In it, back to that causal chain, we focused on just the black parts of the causal chain. And so we were looking at perceptions of injustice or unfairness. We did include rhetoric, but I'm not going to talk about that today because of time. We looked at resentment and anger. We did not look at anxiety. We also looked at positive emotions as an antidote. Here we looked at negative partisanship and outgroup existential threat variables. And then we looked at populism as attitudes and democratic norm violations. So just to show you the pieces that we took out of the larger theoretical frame. So what we did was we asked them, this is the first part of it, we tried to prime the emotions that we wanted, both positive and negative, coming from this perception of injustice, because that's what we wanted to test, the relative deprivation. So we just said, think of a time when you or someone close to you was treated unfairly, and write a few sentences about it. And then another group, so we divided the sample into 3 groups. So that was one. Another condition was, think of a time when someone helped you out, and write a few sentences about it. So that's a solidarity kind of frame. And then a control group that had no activity. So that was the first part of the experiment. We did have a second part that had to do with rhetoric, as I said, but I'm not going to do that one today. Then we asked them to fill out an emotions questionnaire. Okay, now that you've done that, how do you feel? And then we gave them questions about our outcome variables. So for the populist attitudes, we used the ideational approach, which is basically looks at these 3 components, and it's a multiplicative index. So people have to have all 3 of these attitudes to be considered populist. They have to be pro-people. They want people to have a say in government, which most people do. That's pretty high. They have to be anti-elite, and they have to have this moralist or Manichaean good versus evil perspective. For the tribalism, we use negative partisanship, which we measured as what is your view, how favorably do you view Democrats, Republicans, Trump supporters, Clinton supporters, liberals, and conservatives. So that was our negative partisanship, was favorability of the view of the out party, what we were trying to get as for their out party. Of course, we asked them how they identified as well, so we knew which is their out party. We asked about intolerance of political opponents with a question about limiting the voice and vote of the opposition. Should the president be able to do that? And then we asked, the democratic erosion, I will point out, it's really liberal democracy, because it's basically, do you support or not, do you agree that elected leaders should follow the law, or should they follow the people's interests? So it has to do with judicial deference, separation of powers, and controlling protests. So questions like that. So what did we find so far? Well, basically, our treatments did prime the expected emotions. And we found that the unfair treatment made people, first, actually disappointed, and then angry, disgusted, sad, resentful, and ignored. The being helped treatment, which we were trying to elicit gratitude, because in the theory of emotions that I examined, gratitude is the opposite of resentment. It was supposed to balance out resentment, so we were trying to get gratitude. And we did find, yes, the help treatment made them grateful, satisfied, and happy. Okay, so far so good. Now, how did these affect populist attitudes as a dependent variable? Did the negative emotions activate them, as other people are arguing that they do? And will the positive emotions deactivate the populist attitudes? Well, first we found that, yes, there is latent populism in the population. And not surprisingly, from 0 to 1 is the scale. Up here at 0.8 is the average. Most people are pro-people. Questions that in favor of the people, making decisions. But anti-elite is pretty high too. So that's pretty widespread in the population generally. But when you add the Manichaean do you view, this is questions like this, we're using the Castanho 2019 scale of questions, if anybody works on populism, we're using that one. And so it's questions about, you know, somebody who thinks differently from me is just a bad person, versus, oh no, they're just, or they're misinformed. So, you know, do you think they're a bad person if they disagree with you, or are you more innocuous about it? So when you multiply all these, you see this is the average in the population, for the populism score. Now, did it change? Well, we found our treatments actually gave mixed results. So unfairness, in fact, working through resentment, which was the theory, the emotion I was most interested in, did increase populism, as expected. We did structural equation models to look at these emotions. And solidarity did increase gratitude and decrease resentment, but it did not decrease populism, working through these emotions. So the solidarity treatment didn't work so well. And then we thought, okay, now, well, let's see if it makes a difference between left and right voters. Is there a difference? Because that was part of our theory, is that it might make a difference between types of voters. So we found clearly two different strands of populism in the United States, and our primes affected them differently. So overall, first off, people are thinking in the United States, Trump populist supporters, not so much. It's the Democrats, especially driven by the Bernie supporters, the Bernie Sanders supporters, that are driving the Democratic Party to have higher populism scores than Republicans. And you got to think about it. Republicans supported Trump across the board. Party ID was the biggest predictor. And there are a lot of Republicans who are not populist. They are the elite. They're not anti-elite. So, when you look at the whole group, they're less populist, actually, than everyone else. And you can see it here. So interesting that, so Trump supporters were actually a little bit lower than Clinton. Even Clinton supporters weren't typically as populist. And Sanders supporters were the highest. And so here's the overall score. Now, if you look at the components, this really helps us see. So blue, we just looked at Trump versus Sanders supporters. So you see the pro-people, the blue, the Sanders are more pro-people, but the Trump are here as well, but less so. The anti-elite, you see an even bigger difference here. Sanders are more anti-elite than the Trump supporters, but here, equally on the Manichaean. Now, so these are the people that, you know, are exhibiting the populism fairly equal on those two. So what we found is that the causal path for the Trump supporters mirrors what we expect and what others have found looking at Europe. That basically it goes through the unfair perception of being treated unfairly, goes through anger and resentment, and that in turn activates populism. So Trump supporters acted as expected. The Sanders supporters, on the other hand, are some different kind of thing that we're still trying to figure out. So the question here is left and right populists, is there a difference? Sanders supporters, yeah, unfair, when it made them angry and resentful, it did increase their populism. But it also, when it didn't go through those emotions, if you just looked at the direct effect of unfair feelings, remembering being treated unfairly, to the total effect, to populism, it did not produce this. So something else is going on in here counteracting the emotions for some Sanders supporters. We don't yet have an explanation for that. Okay, our second dependent variable, negative views of opponents. So that's this negative partisanship. How unfavorable do you view the other political camp? Did feeling like you've been treated unfairly have an effect on that? Or feeling the more positive emotions, did that make you view the other side more favorably? Well, difference between Democrats and Republicans. Unfair treatments worsen Democrat views of Republicans and Trump supporters. So yeah, if you're feeling resentful and angry, you're going to view the other side worse off. But it didn't change Republican views of Democrats, which were, started out fairly about the same, 3.6 on a 1 to 5 scale, 5 being the most unfavorable. It didn't change Republicans. They just stayed unfavorable. And disappointingly, the helped treatments, feeling the positive emotions, did not improve the views of either side toward the other. So that was disappointing. All right, what about our third dependent variable, the outgroup threat perceptions? Well, our treatments, trying to elicit these different feelings and emotions, did not significantly change them, but we already have very high threat perceptions. Democrats and Republicans view each other as threats in the United States. We started out at very high levels, 0.62 and 0.63 out of 1.0. So we figured, okay, we didn't change them, but they were already pretty high. And then finally, the Democratic erosion. This I thought was really interesting, that it differs by party, again, our experiment, that Republicans here, the green, as they get the unfair treatments, as they are feeling like they've been treated unfairly, they are more willing to support the violation of democratic norms. Democrats on the other side are less so, and independents. Democrats are blue, independents are red. As they get the unfair treatments, they want more democracy. So that led us to think, okay, now why is that? Why is that? Is it that Democrats are just more committed, normative Democrats? Are they just more committed to democracy? Or is it that they're out of power and they think they can use democracy to get in power, and they want their civil liberties protected and they want separation of powers protected? So that leads us to our next project. So our conclusions of the first one are, yeah, perceptions of unfairness and negative emotions do increase populism and tribalism overall, but gratitude is not a consistent antidote, so we need to look at something else. And so we're thinking of looking at compassion with this idea of a shared humanity. If we can get across the idea that these other people are also human beings and share some common things with us, would that help? And compassion being sort of the flip side of gratitude is someone's helping you, you're grateful. Compassion is your motivation to help others who are suffering. Or maybe some kind of shared identity through, is there an inclusive nationalism that we could get that wouldn't be the exclusive nationalism we hear from the right-wing populists who are trying to emphasize a national identity that's exclusionary? Can we have a more inclusive nationalism? Maybe that could be an antidote. And the second conclusion was these partisan differences. So there's something different about left-right populism, but also there's something different, at least in the United States, about the partisan reactions to polarization in terms of how much they will support democratic norm violation. So we came up with these 3 hypotheses, which is what we want to test now. Is it because it's whoever is in power, no matter which ideology, which party, which kind of people, whoever's in power is willing to support, in a highly polarized context, is willing to support democratic norm erosion to stay in power because the other side is such a threat, we got to keep them out of power. And see, the reason why in our original theory, what we came up with, either side would violate democratic norms because of the threat. Like in Venezuela, they want a military invasion to get rid of Maduro because it's so negative. They're willing to go to a military invasion. So obviously not using democratic means because the threat's so high. But in this case, we have the Democrats in the United States, aren't willing to go that far. So is it because it's just whoever's in power versus out of power and kind of what the capacity is, or maybe how far gone the democracy is already? Or is it something about the ideological differences among the parties in terms of their normative commitment to democracy? Or is it just all the research is done on personality trait differences? The conservatives care more about authority and loyalty, and liberals care more about, you know, justice and carrying the kind of Jonathan Haidt stuff on moral foundations, things like that. So that's why, and I'll finish with this, our next experiment that we're trying to put in the field now, we're going to test new antidotes and democracy trade-offs in the US and Hungary with these hypotheses. The higher the level of polarization, the more willing somebody is to trade off democracy for whatever benefit they feel like they're getting. Again, because they need their camp to stay in power, because the other is a threat. And while their camp is in power, they're getting either some kind of economic benefit, some cultural benefit, some national identity benefit. So this kind of goes to Milan Shvoli, who's been doing work on this kind of democracy trade-offs. Or is it that whenever you're co-partisan, whenever your party is in power, you're willing to trade off democracy to stay in power? And the other side, as long as there's still some democratic means to work, are not willing. And then the antidotes that we're testing now, we're going to try this common humanity. We've got an experiment for compassion and gratitude, and then we've got a perspective taking. And will that reduce the perception of outgroup threat, and thus our theorized willingness to trade off democracy? So we're putting those in the field right now as pilots with students, and then we're going to do national surveys in Hungary and the United States. So that's an overview, and I would love your comments, suggestions, questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.